Welcome to another episode of Mindful City, Tuning into Life, a podcast to discover and celebrate the many ways that our city is using mindfulness in our practical daily lives. Welcome to another episode of Mindful City, Tuning into Life. I am honored to have Laura from Ayamveda with us today. If you recall, Laura did a session with us where she introduced us to Vedic astrology, also known as Jyotish. And it was a really beautiful podcast that I actually have gone back to several times to kind of understand a little bit the difference between Western astrology, what I've learned so far. And so I've asked Laura to join us again because I'm not sure if you've been on the planet Earth in the last few months, just in case you missed it. There's been so much going on internally on an individual level, within relationships, people and family, with a global pandemic. We've had racism being brought to the surface. We've had protests. I could just go on and on because there's been a lot going on in terms of immigration and reform and a lot of political things. And we don't want to go into the discussion of those things and the political meaning of those things. But I remember one time talking to Laura and about something happening individually with me, and I had a follow-up meeting with her. And when she explained the planetary alignment, it completely explained what was happening to me. And it actually gave me a sense of, I don't know if control is the way, but a sense of hope and a sense of, okay, so this is what was supposed to happen. Now what do I do to make it go the way that I want it to go? So that's kind of why I asked for you to come back, because not only on an individual basis, but I think just for my friends, for my followers here, for the community, there's so much that we can learn about what the planets have been saying to us over the last few months that can help us to navigate how we respond to our current circumstances. Yeah. So that was a long introduction to introduce you to Laura, my can I say my personal Vedic astrologer? Yes. Who is now your Vedic astrologer. So welcome, Laura, and thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me back. I loved our conversation last time, so I'm looking forward to today's as well. Yeah, welcome to 2020. It has definitely been, whoever you are and whatever you've experienced and whatever perspectives you hold. I mean, I don't think there's a single person on this planet that this year has not rocked in some way. Mm-hmm. And there's definitely been a lot that has happened and continues to happen in some ways as well. I think on the last call, after we actually ended the podcast itself, you and I kept chatting. And during that, I was kind of sharing with you that I think it was right before Mars went into Capricorn, if I remember correctly.
Yes, it was.
And at that point, so that was mid to late March, and Mars went into Capricorn on March 22nd, where it joined Saturn. And what's so interesting about that is that Mars, of course, is that fiery warrior energy, and Saturn is debt, disease, and responsibility. And these two planets essentially are arch enemies. Okay. And right. And, just like we all have natal birth charts, every country has its own birth chart. Every idea has its own birth chart. There's a moment in which something is birthed and it has its own chart for that reason. And so when you look at, for example, the United States birth chart, 1776, I don't remember offhand what time it was, decided that America was born, but it was, of course, July 4th. And, during that moment, Leo was the rising sign. And so what that means is that when Mars moved into Capricorn with Saturn, it was happening in the United States' sixth house. And the sixth house is very Saturn-like. It's all about debt and disease. And so when you combine two planets together like that, you get an explosion. And that was the exact day, interestingly enough, when case numbers in the United States started to skyrocket. So it kind of
health explosion in a way.
Health explosion, exactly, as well as debt explosion.
That's
right then, all at the same time. The house, sixth house, stands for both of those things. And then, not long after, on the 29th of March, Jupiter moved into that same house with them, and Jupiter actually gets debilitated in that sign of Capricorn. And so,
when you say debilitated, do you mean like subdued?
Yeah, so it's like a place in the zodiac where there's a place in the zodiac where each planet can get expressed best, where its energies can be accentuated and really where it can gift you with its full expression, and that's called exaltation. And then there's also a place in the zodiac where each planet feels like it's completely weakened and it can't express the way it wants to. And Jupiter, when I say Jupiter gets debilitated in Capricorn, Jupiter stands for hope, amongst other things. It stands for hope. And so Jupiter got debilitated when it moved into this very explosive type environment in the house of debt and disease. And so that's kind of
that time was like that. That time felt incredibly hopeless.
For sure. And a lot of, sorry, yeah, go on.
No, I was saying especially because we didn't even know what this was. I mean, we still don't to some extent, but exactly. we didn't even know what was happening, especially if it wasn't directly affecting you. We had no idea what this was. And you're hearing all these things to try to mitigate it coming from everywhere. And you just really feel like we're doomed.
Right.
That was my feeling, at least.
Absolutely. Yeah. The shutdown started right when Jupiter became debilitated. The whole country was basically like, a lot of states on April 1st were just like, now we're closed. And that was literally a day after Jupiter moved into its debilitation. And so there was just such a sense of hopelessness and, explosive, what is going on type feeling.
No, that explains that for sure.
Absolutely. And then, what's interesting is I'm just going to kind of recap the last few months, if that's the way we want to go, and feel free to interrupt me.
Please.
Yeah. Yes. So, what's interesting is that, the month of April, every single month has some transits, and even the moon, who transits very fast, goes through all the zodiac signs in 1 month's time. So it's not that nothing ever happens in a specific month, but there are months where things are quieter. And then there are months when things are quite loud in terms of how many planets are transiting. And the month of April was a very quiet month by and large. And you can see that everyone was literally turning in. There was not much going on other than nobody knew what the heck was happening and everything was shut down. And then, what's so interesting is I was predicting that on the 4th of May, that we would have a huge shift happen. And it's not even necessarily a big shift always, but right now I just feel like Mars energy is so strong in the world. And so when I started seeing that, okay, Mars is about to move into the sign of Aquarius on May 4th, I was like, that's when things are going to start, not necessarily even just opening up again, but there'll be a lot of protesting, because Aquarius is essentially the intellectual who likes to protest and make points be known. And I found it so fascinating because so many of these states were saying, okay, we're closed for 30 days. And most of them closed right around on April 1st. So theoretically, you would think that they would open on May 1st. But what did they do? At least here in Florida, I didn't follow where, every single state opened. But in Florida, it specifically opened on May 4th, which is exactly when Mars moved into Aquarius. And around the country, you started seeing the lockdown protests like really escalating on that same date.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
Very interesting. And then right around mid-May, we started getting tons of retrogrades. First it was Saturn, then it was Venus, then it was Jupiter. And again, that's not very common to have so many so many planets go into retrograde at the very same moment. And
What is
so,
the effect of retrogrades, like generally? Are they
yeah.
different by each planet? And then what is the culmination of several of them at a time?
Yeah, they are different for each planet. I mean, in some ways they're the same because they're always about introversion. So essentially, a retrograde planet, it's what it means is that when you look up at the sky, when an astronomer looks up at the sky, it will appear as though this planet is actually moving backwards as opposed to forwards.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not that the planet actually is moving backwards, but in relation to our own speed, it looks like that. And so, it's similar to when you're sitting in a car or you're driving in a car and, the highway next to you, like the images on the highway, they just look blurry and they look like they're moving backwards, but they're not, they're not moving backwards. You're just moving faster. And so it looks like things are moving out of your vision backwards. And so it's very similar to that. And the idea of retrograde is that it's about not being able to move forward. And it's because those planets symbolically are asking us to look within and not make these forward moving steps. So it's about reflective introversion. So in that sense, they're all the same. What retrograde means the same thing. But then when you take the symbology of each planet, each one is asking you to look within in a completely different way.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Mercury, we're all familiar with. I think, everybody knows about Mercury retrograde. It's so is it the same in Vedic astrology that Mercury is the planet of communication?
Yes, very much so. So Mercury is the planet of communication. And so a lot of times Mercury retrograde gets the bad rep because it happens so much more often, right? Yes. It gets the bad rep of being responsible for every single thing that could ever go wrong in life. But Mercury, it all depends. It all depends on your own birth chart, your country's birth chart, and so many different things as to how it's going to affect you and the broader community. If you have Mercury in one of the darker houses in your birth chart, or if it's transiting one of your darker houses, then you're probably going to struggle with Mercury retrograde more, but somebody else might actually really, really benefit.
Yeah, that's right. There's always both sides, right? It could be a benefit for you. You could take it as a benefit if you want, or however you see that happening. I think that's why I feel what you're sharing is so important, because I think knowing and understanding what's kind of happening on a planetary plane, to call it that, I think it gives you strength. It gives you power of choice. Although other people may say you don't really have a choice. That's a whole other subject. But I feel it gives me kind of this clarity with that information to then decide how I'm going to navigate.
Absolutely.
This time. Yeah.
Well, and it's
sorry, I cut you off on the retrograde. So I know
it's okay.
Okay.
I mean, at the very least, what it is. I mean, astrology in some ways is very much fate. So it's an interesting conversation, which isn't necessarily where we're going today, fate versus free will, but it is a fascinating one. But the interesting thing about us, I'll just, say one sentence about it, because in terms of free will within astrology, it's about how you respond to the fated experience. And so, I think you're right to say that, like, you look at your birth chart, you hear about your birth chart and how the transits currently are affecting you. And in a certain sense, you were like, you stepped away from that consultation being like, okay, all of this is happening for a reason. And that's the fate part. But at the same time, now you can really just embrace it in a totally different way, potentially,
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So from the retrograde part then, what were the other planets that were in retrograde and at that time?
Yeah. So Saturn started, then Venus, and then Jupiter. And essentially, obviously there's been so much that's happened, so I don't want to gloss over anything that's been significant or important in the lives of so many people. But, we had the protests earlier for the lockdown, and then all of a sudden, this tragic event in which this man was unjustly murdered, occurred with George Floyd. And during that time, you know, all of those retrogrades were happening. So it's a very introverted time in which we all were like, oh shit, who am I? How do I play a role in this? You know, it was asking us to really dive deep and look within during that time. And of course, the moon was waxing at that point, so emotions were on the rise. The moon was also with Mercury and Rahu in the sign of Gemini. So a lot of like unknowns, uncertainties, a lot of fear. And those retrogrades, again, like they're just saying, you know, look within, look within, look within. And you know, I think particularly Venus retrograde in that particular moment was very powerful, because Venus is, of course, the planet of beauty and love and, you know, so many like luxuries and comforts. So essentially, AKA privilege, that kind of thing, you know. So Venus was actually burnt by the sun during that time. It was not only was it retrograde and therefore asking us to reflect on what we believe to be beautiful, but it was also being burnt by the sun. It was too close to the sun in the sign of Taurus at that time. And so when a planet is so close to the sun, it can express itself. And when Venus and sun come together in conjunction, which is what happened during that time, there is a lot of insecurity. There's a lot of not being able to see the beauty, not being able to understand beauty, not feeling valuable enough for to own that beauty. And all that kind of comes up with that moment in time. And so I just find that, you know, that clearly played out.
Absolutely. And I can attest to that just on a personal level, which you also knew, because Laura actually texted me just to check in. She's like, I see some things in the planet and I'm just wondering how you're doing.
Yeah.
And you know, a lot of that, now that you explained that to me, I do see it more clearly.
Absolutely.
Because for me, it was that time of recognizing what I saw as this beautiful, loving planet, you know, and what I saw and how true was that really, and through what eyes was I looking at that, and then really going within, because I needed to understand, and that's always been my way of beginning to express myself, is I kind of want to do that inner journey first, right, and then express myself. So, and in that process, there was a lot there, which I'm sure everyone's been going through individually, who's been doing this work
right
themselves. So the way you just beautifully explained about Venus, that really clarifies that journey for me, that I was going through and coming to understand what that is, and the value that I feel of myself and for my people. And so I think that's been an amazing journey in itself. Something that you and I could talk about definitely another time, is just that journey itself. But yeah, so, and then what about Saturn though? Because I don't want to leave it, because Saturn has a very interesting, you know, place in our lives, but also in my personal journey. So I'm curious how Saturn's retrograde affected this for all of us.
Yeah, I mean, well, Saturn again is it's the planet that brings us the hardest lessons that so many of us don't enjoy facing. I mean, I tend to be a very Saturn-y person, so for better or worse, I embrace death in a very weird way. That might be way too much information for this podcast, but you know, Saturn is a hard planet, and it's a very serious planet. So you know, people who have strong Saturns tend to be more serious, as opposed to this gleeful, joyful, you know, energy all the time. You know, there's a saying that actually Mercury, who is considered the child of the planets, that he is the most gestury of all the types, and that Saturn absolutely loves Mercury, because on his own, Saturn is so serious.
Yes.
And yet Mercury is the only one who can kind of just jump into the room and you know, make things a little bit more light. And so whenever we're going through Saturn things like disease, depression, debt, you know, all of these things, if you can, you know, the remedy to that is always tapping into wherever your Mercury is in your chart. because Mercury will always bring a lightheartedness. And so, you know, he brings laughter, even amongst the pain. And so Saturn being retrograde, of course, is a very deep look at, you know, your own health, your own finances, things like that. So because he stands for those things, you know, I'm sure each person was kind of like, ooh, how is my health right now? You know, how are my finances right now? Can I withstand these trials and tribulations? You know, and so that's really what the Saturn retrograde was asking us to do. And not only that, but Saturn, you know, is sitting in the sign of Capricorn, astronomically as well as Vedically. And so Capricorn is his own sign, and he's very comfortable expressing there. And, you know, the reason I actually contacted you, and I obviously won't go into personal details over this, but like the reason I contacted you on the day that I did was because, you know, you're a Capricorn rising. So I knew that this was all happening in your very first house, your identity house. And then not only that, but, you know, Venus being retrograde and combust by the sun in your house of joy was like, yes, you know, enough for me to be like, oh, is Helen okay? You know,
Helen was definitely going through that. And the part of the identity, when you mentioned that to me, that really got me, because that's where I was spending a lot of time with myself.
Yeah.
To really understand what is my identity? Like, have I been really expressing my identity appropriately?
Right.
Have I really looked at it?
Yeah.
And I had to, you know,
Absolutely.
this time called for me to do that. So definitely that's what was going on.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's just always so interesting just to, you know, I mean, people always laugh because they're like, how on earth do you, like, you know, after I've really dived into someone's chart, I almost like at least 50% know it off the top of my head. So yes. It's like, so many times people are like, you remember my chart that well? And I'm like, yeah, like I worked with it for a while, you know?
Yeah. You really go in, you dive deep.
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, I'm glad you're okay though.
Yes. I've learned a lot. Yeah. So how did we move then from May, like into June? Did joy at all reappear, or is joy still on its way?
You know,
I meant hope. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, actually it's an interesting question, because I mean, there's so many different ways that, you know, problems can arise in our charts. And so, from the standpoint of Jupiter being in the sign of Capricorn, where it's debilitated, it did at the very end of June, it actually, it remained in retrograde, but because it was remaining in retrograde, it was moving backwards into the zodiac sign. So it actually went right back into Sagittarius on June 29th. And it loves being in Sagittarius because it can actually express there. It's its own sign. So there's a lot more hope after June 29th. And I think the way that really played out for so many people, you know, and the funny thing is it plays out differently for each of us just because we all have different charts. And yet the energy will still be there for all of us. Yes. And so, you know, for some that might have been, you know, political and justice oriented angles. And for others, it might've been like, okay, relief. I feel like I can talk a little bit more today than I felt silenced before, or, you know, there's different ways that's going to express in each individual. But I think, you know, it was so funny. Our mutual friend, Ashley, called me that morning and she's like, I have not been able to like breathe properly for a long time. And today I finally can. And I was like, oh yeah, Jupiter went to Sagittarius. You know?
That explains it.
Yeah. It's just so interesting. And of course that doesn't mean that the problems are all over or that everyone's feeling like complete relief, but there is a huge shift in that energy of how it feels. And, you know,
there's also been movement though, you know, yes. So even though there's been an uprising, we're all looking at the things that we need to. We're doing the inner work, we're doing outer work. There has seemed to been a little bit of some movement because we've all been looking at it.
Right.
And so now I am seeing that. So that alone would bring some sense of hope, you
right.
know?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, you know, there's just, but at the same time, you know, what's so interesting is that on the same day that Mars went into Aquarius, that day where we started seeing the lockdown protests happening, and also, opening of some states like Florida and I believe, Georgia and a few others. On that same day, Rahu and Ketu, which are of course the demons of the zodiac, they also came to a standstill. And that doesn't happen too often. But between May 4th and I believe sometime in August, I unfortunately didn't write it down and I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's in August, Rahu and Ketu stopped moving, essentially the way that it's seen in the skies anyway, And so what that means is that there's this stagnancy in the air and nothing's really progressing forward or backwards. And so we can see that still happening right now. It's like, well, what's going on with COVID? It's sort of like this, this heavy cloud, and we're like, what direction is it moving in? And it, some people are saying it's getting worse, and some people are like, this is a joke. And there's so many different energies to it, but it's not really. It's stagnant. It's not
just
really,
kind of there.
Yeah, it's this hovering energy, and that's exactly what Rahu Ketu do to us when they go stagnant like that.
Oh my goodness. I've obviously never heard it said in this way. And it's incredible to see the impact of the planets and how that's affecting us. So what do you, I know you don't call yourself much of predictive astrologer, but whatever, do you feel comfortable in terms of, from what you're seeing right now, what do you feel the planets are asking us to do, and how can we empower ourselves for the next few months, moving forward? Is there anything that you see that could really benefit us as we move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky because, like you said, I don't really call myself a predictive astrologer. I feel very confident in this area of my passions and my studies, but at the same time, because life is infinitely complex, and I don't presume myself arrogant enough to say that I know what's going on. But what I will say is that the way that the planets look to be moving over the next few months, especially into September. Now, July is a pretty easy month compared to others, I will say. Like, there's less transits going on. August is, a little bit more, but really into September. What happens in September is that Rahu and Ketu, the demons of the sky, essentially, and I don't want to, demon can be taken however you want it to mean, but to me it means ego. It means, it's the belief in separation. Those planets, or false planets rather, they actually only move into a new position every like roughly year and a half. And so they don't move very much compared to other planets. They're really slow moving. And so right now they've been in Gemini, Rahu's been in Gemini, and Ketu has been in Sagittarius, and they can express themselves relatively well there. They're about to go in September, they're about to move into, Rahu will move into Taurus and Ketu will move into Scorpio. And that's a very, very venomous place for them to be.
Okay.
So that's really concerning, especially for the United States going into this election. And
that's right.
Yeah. So I think that it's just really, I think, important for us all, if you ask for advice on a more general level, I think especially come late September, really doing even more work to not be extra inflammatory and, listen to other perspectives, that kind of thing. It's really, really important, because otherwise that energy can become very vile and very toxic very easily. So it's interesting that that's the energy that will literally eclipse the elections.
Okay, so we have work to do. We have to find ways that we can maintain, be centered, to be in touch with just clean and a clear intellect at all times. I think the importance of having a meditation practice or a prayer practice, or being in a nature practice, whatever it is that just makes you feel grounded, because
Yeah.
we're going to just require that groundedness to then come into clarity in how we're going to proceed and where we want to have our voice heard.
Absolutely.
So I definitely see that that's going to have to be part of the regiment
For sure.
for the next few months. I don't want to end this conversation, because
I know.
there's so much more, and I have 5 million questions.
I know.
But
Did I literally just share this? There's so much more of it.
I know, because I was thinking to myself, I'm like, all right, after 30 minutes, people, just the intellect starts going in different ways. But
right.
I think you've shared with us so much right now for us just to take that time to reflect back on what has happened, and then see how that impacted us individually. And then what you left us with, that causes us to really think about how we want to show up in the next few months, I think is so important. And then if you're willing, I would love to do another session to look at the other part of the other few months and see how that impacts. If you're willing to do that, I would love to continue this conversation.
Yeah, sure. That'd be fun.
Time. Oh, thank you so much. I love having you on the show, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Okay, you too. Thank you so much, Helen.
Thank you, Laura. Namaste.
Namaste.
To find out more about Vedic astrology and Laura, find her on social media under Ayamveda, Ayamveda, Ayamveda.